So, good evening. So this is going to be a little bit more of an impromptu live stream. I think I have a topic prepared, but it's not something that I have had a long time to think about. It's more of an off-the-cuff reaction. So I'm going to let people have a chance to gather in after the stream starts, and you can also tell me if my boomer audio is having any problems. But today we're going to talk about really all of the goings-on with the riot currently. But in particular, I think what I'd like to talk about here is pushing back against violence from the left. And this is something that I've talked about a little bit. I've kind of been back on Twitter against my better judgment, and in the process I've gotten drawn into a conversation about how we can push back against out-and-out leftist violence. And in the latest round of rioting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, there was a very high-profile instance of, I think it was just a kid, a 17-year-old, who was defending himself against a whole mob of Antifa. The exact way that the conflict kicked off is still a bit touch and go. We don't know everything about it, I should say. But what apparently happened once the video started rolling was a bunch of Antifa guys were running after him, after which he opened fire on several of them and killed two. Now, this sounds pretty atrocious from the raw facts of the matter, but since the initial report came in, a lot of facts have emerged that seem to make this look like a very open and shut case of self-defense. The kid, I think he's 17, so I'm going to call him a kid. I guess you could say the man who was defending himself was essentially responding to someone who had thrown a bag at him, and there was a gunshot that went off in his vicinity. He fired back and then immediately tried to remove himself from the situation and was pursued by an enormous number of crazy people, one of which at least had a gun. And then there was a second round of firing once it was impossible to escape. In fact, the classic picture of this is Kyle. I don't know his last name, I forget it, and probably it's not a good idea to circulate it. He's literally back on the ground, planted, pointing a gun up at someone else who's swinging his own handgun around and catching him just before he's able to bear down and potentially kill him. And this kind of reminded me of that classic Reservoir Dogs scene where Harvey Keitel and Steve Buscemi's character, they both have guns drawn on each other. Whenever I was in high school and I ever heard of an example of shooting someone in self-defense, I always had the image of Steve Buscemi's character pointing the gun upwards at Harvey Keitel, who's pointing the gun down at him. And this is just the perfect example of this. But I think this kicked off a conversation within right-wing Twitter that I know it's been a long time coming. I think a lot of people in right-wing Twitter, especially, as you might imagine, a lot of people who got out ahead of the mainstream media, they saw this and they determined that this guy was, in fact, he didn't appear, at least based on the evidence we've been able to collect, he didn't appear to be guilty of being a pernicious murderer. Of course, CNN and the rest of the cable networks have been essentially portraying this guy as some kind of school shooter, and the Antifa people who tried to hurt or murder him as being people who were trying to neutralize an active shooter. That was their go-to line for the entire affair. And well, a lot of things about this. First of all, what was unusual was that after 2 days, I think it's only been around 2 days, but today, for sure, we've seen a lot of the normie conservative establishments get on board with defending this guy. This didn't happen in other instances, most prominently would be Charlottesville, where the normie conservatives went all out in condemning the entire affair for a variety of reasons, some justified, some not. This time, there was a sense that everyone who's even a little bit on the right was pushing back on this narrative that Kyle was an active shooter that was being neutralized by Antifa. And I think a lot of this had to do with the specific circumstances. Kyle was seen before volunteering to remove graffiti. There was testimony of witnesses that on the first shooting, the people who were assaulting Kyle were trying to take his gun away. There were multiple angles and videos that literally showed him leveling his rifle at people who were pointing a handgun back at him, making it obviously self-defense. And through this all, the narratives that the media were trying to spin around this kid, fell through. And I think there was a lot of premature rejoicing on the right about this. So the issue here is, I notice a lot of people saying things like, well, we should be pushing back against Antifa more. We need to be ready to defend ourselves in the same way that Kyle defended himself. And I think I got myself into a little bit of hot water by saying that this is really the wrong way to look at things. No, I do agree from the evidence I've seen that he was completely in the right and was acting in self-defense when he was taking on these assailants, and even when he fired on them. It seems very, very clear. And Vaush, of course, in typical manner, had this great stream where he was debating with Destiny, and he was trying to defend the leftist line that this guy was an active shooter, and of course, everything fell apart for Vaush. And it's kind of it's pretty hilarious dialogue if you wanna see Vaush and Destiny debating against each other. But just beyond the actual gotchas that Destiny was able to lay down on Vaush, there exists the simple reality that everyone knows, not only about Vaush, but also about CNN and the rest of the mainstream media. And that reality is that if the politics and or the races of the belligerents involved in this confrontation, if they had been reversed, if anything had changed about the circumstances in terms of who it politically benefited, the exact opposite narrative conclusion would have been reached. People would have concluded that the person, if it had been a leftist that had fired back on far-right thugs trying to come in and murder him or bearing a gun down on him, this would be the height of self-defense. He would be a hero. He would be probably praised by presidential candidates, and we all know the song and dance. And the same thing is true for Vaush. We know that there is not some kind of consistent standard for self-defense. There's an understanding that this particular person was on the right, and therefore the narrative was crafted post hoc, after the fact, to make it seem like the right-winger was in the wrong. And of course, the facts this time did not bear that out. Okay, so looks like superficially the right wing has a victory on its hands. But this is, I feel, where people kind of get ahead of themselves. This kid, Kyle, he wasn't doing anything wrong by bearing arms and by just walking through a city, or even crossing state lines to defend a community against incursions and property damage. There's nothing implicitly wrong with that. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's an action, but I think it was a foolish one. I think that if we're going to talk about behavior that's good to pursue going forward, we can't afford to take these kind of risks. The reason, obviously, Kyle is currently charged with first-degree murder. Based on the evidence that I've seen, based on the discovery as it's been released to the public, these charges almost certainly will not stand. But had only a few details been different, the exact same events could have played out, and Kyle could have gone to jail for the rest of his life, and beyond that personal tragedy, the left would have a new narrative to spin in order to hurt the dissident right and in order to further bludgeon conservatives writ large at the national stage. And I think everyone can see this. One of the reasons why it's so easy to defend Kyle is in Kenosha, or we could call him Kenosha Kyle, perhaps. I don't know. See a lot of people on Twitter calling him that. The reason why it's so easy to defend this guy is there's cameras from multiple angles showing him swinging his rifle around on someone who's trying to shoot him in the head. And we also have testimony from one of the Antifa people announcing his intention to indeed kill Kyle if he had the chance. And we have another witness saying that one of the people was trying to grab his gun. I mean, those are very, very fortuitous witnesses and moments that have been captured by digital media, and that are going to not only exonerate Kyle Tanisha, Kyle, it sounds so weird. I'll say Kyle. They won't only exonerate Kyle in the courtroom, they also, apparently this week, exonerated him in the realm of public opinion. And so the problem is that we can't rely on that. And this is, everyone's talking about self-defense and the responsibility to defend our communities and standing up to the left. This is just not going to work without a lot of caution. So I think people are sort of forgetting that what they do is they digress. People who watch these instances as they play out on Twitter, they kind of unlearn the red pill lessons that we've learned in the last 10 years. They seem to believe that, okay, well, Kyle was in the right and he triumphed. Therefore, he must have triumphed because he was in the right. Or because he was in the right, he must necessarily triumph. And that's absolutely not the case. If the cameras hadn't been there at exactly the right places, if the witnesses hadn't given exactly the right testimony, the media could just make up the details of this interaction, and that would be the narrative we would hear. None of the mainstream right-wingers, like the Daily Wire, would defend this kid, and subsequently, the leftist narratives about what happened might indeed even be the stuff that was written, that was read as true inside the courtroom, and they might as well convict him for first-degree murder. And I will say this, I mean, Kyle was being altruistic, coming and defending a community that he was not a part of. But he did not need to put himself in this situation. And my statement on this, again, disagreed with by many people on Twitter, is that it's not enough to be in the right. You have to actually be intelligent about the war we're fighting. We're fighting a narrative war with the left. This narrative war concerns a story that comes out about the events that happen in the news. The person who controls that story controls the victory. And this story is built out of little itty-bitty moments that occur inside any interaction, and that, you know, it's not really up to any of us to control. If these moments aren't captured by third parties, the media is going to fill out this narrative however they want it, and they're not going to be kind at all about this. They're going to paint the worst possible picture of any individual that's acting out against what in reality are their proxies. And more than that, there's a reality of what people call the fog of war. I mean, the fog of war is a real thing. This is whenever you go into a situation where people are trying to harm each other. Chaos is essentially reigning. And because of that, things that would be immediately apparent to you become blurry. And obvious details become lost. And you're operating on the basic level, your most basic level of instinct, and you revert to your most basic level of training. So if you don't have your behavior down pat, you're going to do stupid things, you're going to do panicky things, who knows? I mean, later today I watched a little bit of the Sargon and Adam and Friended stream that concerned the debate between Bausch and Destiny on this particular engagement. And all through it, Sargon was saying something like, man, this guy is one cool cucumber. I would never have the trigger discipline not to just pull the trigger multiple times and kill some of the people who are running away. Because, he actually nails the people who are coming towards him. And that's true. I mean, if you're in fear of your life, it's amazing. It's amazing that you only can shoot the people who are actually putting your life at risk, and not just the people who are there in front of you. And if that occurs, and again, you don't have the specific circumstances, if you're suffering from the fog of war, you're going to do stupid things. And you could basically destroy your life and the life of any movement that you're attached to. This is simply not worth the risk, in my opinion. And I think that we've sort of forgotten, or not necessarily we've forgotten, but we're at risk of forgetting at this stage a minor victory we had in absentia the last 8 months, or oh my God, it's not 8 months. It hasn't, but the last 4 months where the riots have been going on. And that is that when these riots started, when the George Floyd riots started, I think it was sometime around late March, early April, Or was it late April? I forget now. But at that point, the right wing knew definitively that the way it was going to get through all of this was going to be to play it cool and to make sure that they did not engage with the left on their ground. There's this classic meme that was going around at the time that that was like two instances. One where the right winger is there and the Antifa goes, the Antifa is attacking him, the BLM is attacking him, the normies are looking and saying, "Oh my God, a Nazi," and the police are saying, "We have Nazis here. We need backup." And, everyone attacks the right winger. But when the right winger is not there, all of these groups attack each other. And that was a very true meme. And for the most part, and I say for the most part, the intelligent right, and actually the right writ large, just stayed out of these circumstances. And I think this has been a huge boom for the distant right, is to not get engaged with the left on the left's own turf. And these blue cities where these riots are going on with BLM and Antifa are the left's turf. Just the other day, I think it was yesterday, a bunch of Trump supporters rolled their trucks into downtown Portland, and it looks like, from the available evidence we have now, one of them was just shot in cold blood. And I don't know, perhaps right-wing Twitter is abuzz about this, but I don't hear much about this in the media. It's more or less a detail. The media line, at least in the sources of media that people in my parents' community would follow, it goes something like this: one dead in clashes between violent Trump supporters and Antifa. And that's, of course, because, of course, there's no good pictures, there's no good witness testimony, who knows who shot who, it's foggy, and if that doesn't need to be reported, then it won't get reported. It will only get reported to the extent that the media feels it will flatter their political goals. And we cannot afford to occupy the frame of our opponents. And for this reason, I think, there needs to be some understanding of the rules of engagement. And this is a much smaller talk than last time, but it's one I just wanted to go over a little bit. There is, maybe this is a broader conversation that I can kind of expand out from all of this, because I noticed that with the reemergence of Mencius Moldbug, and with people talking again about the clear pill or pacifism or any other neo-reactionary ideas that are ordinarily associated with people who are trying to be post-political, I can sense that there is a large amount of frustration. We're essentially sitting back and watching the country burn. What are we doing about it? How can we possibly justify this? It sounds like it's just us justifying cowardice. It's just intellectuals, and this is the characterization of neo-reaction always, it's just intellectuals fapping around, trying to feel self-important and aloof, and like they're too good to actually get their hands dirty. And in the meantime, the country is burning and they're not doing anything about it. Whereas the brave people like Kyle are going out and actually taking a stand. And like I said, I don't think that, certainly I don't want to cast aspersions if the facts that we have right now are correct. And the circumstances unfolded like it looks like they did unfold. I certainly don't want to cast aspersions onto Kyle. He was certainly in the right, and he took a risk. But this is not the question for the broader political movement or the collectivity of the broader political movement. People need to be intelligent about how they do this. It's not enough just to be in the right, even if you are on the right. There needs to be an understanding of exactly how this action incorporates itself into a larger narrative. And in this sense, the avenues for these kind of direct confrontations, even with really bad actors inside blue cities, is insane. I feel like, I know the left, the right kind of learned this after Charlottesville, that you cannot control the narrative in these areas. But when you're engaging, you have to be aware that you're not a conservative. You're not defending some status quo order. And in many ways, this is the chief liability of right-wing causes, is this is the problem with the Roman Empire too. During the fall of the Roman Empire, one of the biggest reasons it was so disastrous, and one of the biggest reasons so much was lost, was that the Roman Empire had all these obligations to defend provinces like Britain and northern France and, I don't know, Syria, for instance, or North Africa or Spain. And it had no ability to hold these properties. Anything outside of the provinces in direct stone throw from Greece and Italy were going to be lost eventually, because the apparatus of the empire didn't have actual power or control over these areas. But in the attempt to conserve this empire, they lost a lot more, and they prolonged, I think, the decline of their own civilization to a very disastrous degree. And this is sort of quintessentially the problem with conservatives and right-wingers right now. We have a hard time coming to terms with what we've lost and then recalibrating our expectations for what we can defend. We see icons from a past instance of America being torn down and desecrated, and we feel like we have to defend these. We're not aware that these are in thoroughly blue cities where everyone wants them torn down, where we have absolutely no real ownership, we have no power, and we certainly don't have an ability to exercise narrative control of these areas. And really, it's the cathedral tearing down its own property, to be quite honest. It's the mainstream institutions, the mainstream narrative-creating institutions, tearing down its own property. And they're essentially trying to bait right-wingers to come into their territory and contest with them for it, because they know that they'll be able to control the narrative. What the left wants more than anything is the ability to have some kind of insane right-wing foil to react against. That's what shores up the feasibility, the sustainability, the workability of their political apparatus. And without that, it's really, really hard to see a way forward. And to be sure, if they don't get it from us, they will try to invent one for themselves. They will invent a phony-baloney right-wing villain or right-wing boogeyman to go after. But it's important that they do that. It's important that whatever right-wing boogeyman they attack, we are not it, and we look nothing like it. That we, in the words of Curtis Yarvin, do not inhabit the frame of our enemies. That we're operating outside of it, or in another way. And this is not to say that we can't defend what's actually ours. But I think in order for an engagement to be good and genuinely a defensive engagement, and I said this before, but I think even beyond being a pacifist, I think that it's just historically true that for right-wingers, the only good engagement are defensive engagements. And it's imperative that the left be seen as the aggressor in all engagements and actually be the aggressor. But it's also important to realize that if you're someone who comes from the great American tradition that existed prior to 2012, then America doesn't really exist in the same way in 2020. And because of that, you as the conservative, you own a lot less. So in order for an engagement to be good or defensive, you need to have an overwhelming case, I think, that whatever you're defending, whatever area you're defending, you own it and you have a right to be there. I noticed that in the case of Kenosha Kyle, the biggest point that the left's bringing up is that he crossed state lines. Of course, this is bullshit. He came from Illinois. It's like a 50-minute drive. Most of the commutes, most of my life had been more than 15 minutes. And so this is just a neighboring community. And it's ironic to hear progressives, people who think that borders are social constructs, suddenly care about state lines. Yet, that being said, the narrative writes itself. The narrative they want to portray is that Kyle in question was not a legitimate defender of this community and was some kind of interloper who was seeking out aggression. Because if he seeks out aggression, he's winning. The second question is, do you have the ability to control narrative in the reigning community? This is sort of the Charlottesville lesson, and this is a hard one for right-wingers because oftentimes the answer is no. And I think that if one of the other three are true, then I think the engagement's still good. But this is an important thing if the right wants to broaden its horizons and say, no, it's important that we defend not only this community, which we have ownership over, but other communities that we technically have nominal ownership over. We have to be able to manage the narrative about what we're doing from day one. And if that can't be managed, then the engagement is going to result in a complete backfire for the right. And then the third possible reason for the engagement being a good one is, I think this is not to be completely excluded, but there's a moral necessity to stand ground. So for instance, I'm a pacifist, but if someone attacks this house that I own, if someone attacks my family, then it doesn't matter that I don't have an overwhelming case for ownership. Well, I do, but I mean, it doesn't matter if I didn't. If we were in some area, some blue area that I didn't own or didn't really have a right to be, it doesn't matter that I don't control the narrative in the place that I live. I have a moral necessity to defend my family, and I can exert that. Whenever you're engaging with these apparatuses that are essentially information controlling objects, like the modern mainstream, the thing you have to ask yourself is, in the eyes of this thing that I'm fighting, what do I own? I mean, just think about that for a second. Of course, if the cathedral or if the mainstream progressives could tell any lie they wanted, I wouldn't own anything. I wouldn't even own the ability to defend my family. My family would be owned by the state or whatever political body progressives felt like was the one they wanted to exert their control through. And I would just be an attendant, an outcropping of that political will. And to the extent that I defied that will, I could be attacked or destroyed. But of course, the progressives don't have 100% control over the narrative. They have a lot of it. They have it more on average than do conservatives or reactionaries or right-wingers, but they don't have 100% control. And so through this, they have to concede that people own their families, they belong to their families, they have ownership over them, meaning they have a right to defend them. They own their homes. They own their communities. They own their places of worship. The cathedral, the mainstream media apparatus, the educational institutions, they're forced to concede these things. And because of that fact, those places can be defended, and defended, I think, very bravely, without the risk of fallout. And I think this is a lesson that the right needs to learn. So that's the end of the first talk I wanted to give. There is another one that I wanted to talk a little bit about, but I think I'm going to get to that a little bit later and do some super chats now. Again, I think that because of the fact that I'm doing these things more frequently, I'm naturally going to be a little bit more laid back about the preparation. So people, I notice there's less super chats this night than there are usually. I will say, again, this is probably going to be my last live stream using super chats. I'm trying to get entropy configured so I can just use that from now on. I'll still answer super chats, obviously, but I want to provide an option for people that is not going through Google, because I don't know. This is kind of ridiculous at this stage. I have restarted the Subscribe Star if people want to donate to me that way, and it took a while for them to reactivate the account, but ultimately it's now working, and I intend to use Subscribestar as a way to get subjects for a Distant stream ahead of time. I'm going to host the conversation there, and then I'll always be targeting things that the community wants me to talk about, and we can move from there. Again, I think this will probably be as long as they usually are, but we'll see. Maybe we'll have a back and forth about any number of topics. I feel like there's really so much to talk about. This had kind of any number of things people want me to chat about. I know one of them was the fact that I just finished Moby Dick, which I will talk about later in the stream. But I think it's kind of an interesting book, and maybe it's more maybe more up than all this talk about rules of engagement and fighting back and people who are burning down communities. But let's get to the super chats for the time being. So Paul for £25. It's good to see that your Subscribestar is back up. Do you ever feel that progressives, even of modest means, are more willing than people of the right to fund organizations and individuals that promote their beliefs? Paul for £20. Thank you so much. That's a really great contribution. This is an interesting point. I'll say yes and no. Most progressives I know This is the issue, though. Most progressives over the course of their life, and I've complained about this too, they tend to have less attachments. They tend to be, progressivism is not just a political objective for them, it's a religion. And it's a religion that oftentimes encourages them not to have families. So when I think about an old conservative who might donate to a political cause like the Republican Party, usually conservative donors are business people, so they usually are more comfortable donating to neocons. Moreover, because of the stigma attached to figures from the distant right, they feel that stigma could very much hurt their business interests. I know a lot of people from the former alt-right, a lot of the people, especially from the Britnet scene, they complain a lot about why aren't there right-wing billionaires, or why aren't there right-wing businessmen who have millions of dollars that are willing to fund right-wing organizations in similar ways as the left has its big pocket donors. And the reason is well, the first obvious reason is that globalization essentially has created the billionaire. There are many right-wing millionaires, to be sure, and there were many more right-wing millionaires. A higher percentage of millionaires were right-wing 100 years ago. The issue is that there weren't any billionaires, really. There might have been one 100 years ago. But the reason why there are billionaires now, even with inflation-adjusted dollars, is because of globalization. Globalization allows for the hyper-leveraging, the ability of someone who has a slightly better mousetrap not just to just make $1 million, but to make $1 billion, because he's not just selling mousetraps in the United States, but he's selling mousetraps in India and China and all of Africa. So the billionaire, in many ways, is a function of globalization itself. They benefit from the system, and in many ways, their system is constructed to benefit their interests. So already there's a disincentive. The other reason why there aren't a lot of distant right millionaire or small business person funders is that it's very difficult to fund distant right projects because it's risky. Everyone who's a small business person has to bend a knee to the legal regime that rules inside of America and inside Western Europe. And that legal regime enforces the standard panoply of HR requirements. The idea that you're not creating a hostile work environment, or that you're not broadcasting something that they can ostensibly call bigotry, or that some progressive judge might not think is bigotry. And for that, it's risky. But I think there are the opportunities for funders, that people who are just standard big pocket donors, like your average more or less successful professional, your average more or less successful small business person that has some minor manufacturing or lumber concern that's not particularly vulnerable to HR or PR catastrophes. There's a possibility for them to donate, but I've noticed something different about donors in that regard. The donors that are on the left, who are of a comparable age, there are more of them because every one of them doesn't have a family. So your average leftist donor who's a professional, they could be a middling community college professor, and they could donate a not insignificant amount to the Democratic Party, because what else are they going to do with it? They don't have kids. They don't have a religion. They don't have a broader community that needs support that they believe in. The Democratic Party, the progressive cause in and of itself, is that community, and there are no competitions. They have a monopoly. This is the reason why I think you have people like ContraPoints immediately eliciting all of this reaction. If you're a conservative, if you're a right-winger, all of those boxes are filled. I talk about this to other people on the right wing. You compare someone like me to ContraPoints. I know ContraPoints is much more successful in terms of overall subscriber count, and obviously they put more effort into their videos. But we started at the same time, so I think it's somewhat of a reasonable comparison. But just think about this. I had a job and a degree to get when I started this YouTube channel, both of which made me vulnerable to exposure. and still do to a certain extent. And in the meantime, since I started my channel, I got married, had a family, had a baby, which needs support and needs a future to be provided for it, on and on and on indefinitely. And that's not something that's not chump change. And it's also something that I can't bet on YouTube, right? I can't, even if YouTube was paying my bills, imagine betting a child's future on the possibility that this platform would continue on into the future, especially if you're a right winger. That would be completely irresponsible. And when you think about it with ContraPoints is never going to be demonetized. They're never going to get anything but puff pieces written about them in the mainstream media. They have an enormous number of funders who see them almost, well, less as a political figure and almost more as a religious figure, if we're being quite honest. And furthermore, they're never going to have kids. The chief responsibility in their life is going to be making YouTube videos from now until they retire. And what did they make? They make, what, 10 videos a year? This year is more than halfway done, and I think they only made 3 videos. 3 videos, and this is the profession. I mean, that's insanely low amount of content, but the funding is there. And I think it's because of the unique situation we find ourselves in. The funding is naturally a lot thinner on the right, and it's for the fact that for any reasonable standard, the left wing is the mainstream. The left wing is the people. The left wing are the people who control the money. So thank you very much for that contribution, Paul. I'm going to go on to the next super chat. Society Man for $5. The Kenosha incident and their reaction to it does work to undermine the lefty narrative that they are rebelling against the power structure. Yeah, but I guess I don't see how. I mean, I guess the riots themselves, I feel, make it seem strange that this entire movement is some kind of rebellion against corporate power structures. That always was. Maybe you can clarify, Society Man. I don't exactly see how this confirms it to someone who's not already convinced that the left wing is indeed. Is indeed the force and power. I don't know. We'd have to see. So, I mean, it is apparent, though, that the American people are getting really tired of the riots. The American people are getting really, really, really tired of these riots. And the fact that, for me, for what's done the most work convincing my progressive friends and family that this is indeed not some kind of grassroots organization, but in fact an extension of the mainstream, is this the behavior of the mayors. The fact that the Portland mayor isn't charging any of the rioters that are caught assaulting state troopers. The fact that the mayor of Seattle, Jenny Durkham, essentially ceded, again, a non-insignificant territory of Seattle over to armed communists, and 3 people got murdered and 16 people got shot, and mass property damage was perpetrated over the course of 2 weeks in a situation she could have ended at will. Those have been the dynamics that have been very, very effective at convincing my friends and family that that the left is indeed in control. And again, they even then they kind of grudgingly concede this point. I don't know. I have to think about that a little bit more. I guess I'm hoping that, and maybe this is just YouTube vanity, I'm hoping that this latest Kenosha Kyle thing might be the beginning of the end of Vaush. I think he definitely belly flopped a debate against Destiny in a way that was pretty embarrassing. And I feel that in it all there is a narrative that's emerging about Vaush that he's not a person to pay attention to if you want to actually get good takes. He's just a person that debates for entertainment and plays frame games with people. I mean, if you followed Vaush's lead and went all in on this, Kyle being an active school shooter on the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin, I think you would have embarrassed yourself quite a bit. maybe you wouldn't have embarrassed yourself on left Twitter or on BreadTube, but I don't know. I mean, eventually there is a cost for being just factually wrong again and again and again and again, and I think that eventually will have a toll that the left has to pay for it. Ducat for $5. Remember the crazy stuff that's happening in democratic cities. I think the chill pill is what is needed, Dave, in my humble opinion. Yeah, I agree with this. I don't know. This phenomenon is still mostly in blue cities. Now, blue cities, let's not be naive about this. Blue cities is where power is actually wielded in this country. This isn't the 19th century. Power is wielded through cities. Narrative control is wielded through cities. So these cities are important. They're very, very important. But they're also things that the right wing does not own. And what's so funny about it is if the right wing comes into a city and fights with Antifa to defend that city's, what's essentially under that city's sovereignty, there's really no better deal for the mainstream media apparatus and mainstream non-elected government, because they get pushback against people who are trying to burn their shit down, and they have an easy scapegoat. There's nothing that the mainstream media does not want more than to tell the American people, and tell them with some evidence, that the reason why their cities are burning right now is because of armed right-wing nutcases that are rolling in on Ford F-150s from the hinterlands. That's the story they want to tell. And the closer we go to telling that story with our own actions, the worse we are for making things for ourselves. The worse we are building anything going forward. And we just need to remember what we've already learned in the last 4 years about how narrative control works. I feel that all throughout this, there's just this constant temptation to unlearn things that we should just have as second nature. And one of them is just the nature of control itself, the nature of how people own things inside sovereign entities. The most fundamental thing to understand is the fact that these people, these mayors like Jenny Durkham, they want to surrender their sovereignty. They don't have solutions for problems. The left is angry about unsolvable problems. They're angry about the fact that the African American population is being policed in proportion to the crime rates committed there. They're angry about the performance of inner city schools. They're angry about their inability to implement the diversity-driven paradise that they promised all of their followers would come into existence. The mayors of these municipalities, don't have a solution for any of these problems, and so they need a scapegoat, or they need someone to surrender their sovereignty to. And that's been essentially the game, is that there's been this consistent incentive to create impossible problems, and then to surrender one's sovereignty in the face of those problems. And I'm afraid that I haven't encountered any better way to play this game other than to remove oneself from it. Eventually, it's going to become apparent that the people in charge of these places are the Democrats. And there's going to be some kind of reckoning with that fact. And afterwards, I think the coalition that controls everything in terms of narrative control will split, and there'll be a new reality inside of America. And at that point, I mean, who knows? At that point, who knows what will happen? But the problems might actually be solved. So, Red6USA for $5. How are you doing during the virus? What's your argument against gay marriage? Why? Do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement will go anywhere? What is the future of the USA? Or he says the future of US, but I assume he means the USA and not us. But, well, I don't know. I mean, how long has the virus been going on? I mean, it feels like it's been going on forever. It's been 6 months of quarantine. And it's been 6 months of quarantine, and now the state that I live on is caught on fire. It's been raining ash here for weeks. And I don't know. I mean, it just felt like social isolation. And I'm someone who's kind of very, very amenable to stepping into social isolation. I'm kind of a shut-in myself, as probably most YouTubers are. I like hanging out with people, but it's something that has to be regular and that it can't have a barrier standing in the way of it. And I feel a lot of times, with the new family and the virus, it's just an excuse to kind of retreat into the inner world. And having a new baby already, it's already this huge time sink. It's already this huge thing that you're involved in. It feels like you're retreating from the world anyway. So it kind of becomes rolled up with all of this. The argument against gay marriage is interesting. I mean, it's not really that interesting. I mean, the problem is it's an argument over definition, correct? I mean, it's an argument over, and this is always what the left plays, is they get the word changed and then they get the reality changed. What we were ostensibly arguing about from 2002 to 2012, and legally until 2015, although again, after 2012, gay marriage was a fait accompli in America, and so I don't really count the last 3 years of it. What we were fighting over was the idiotic debate resolution of the definition of a word. And obviously, words can mean whatever you want them to mean. And the Democrats treated this as, how can we define marriage as the way that is most inclusive? Never, ever, ever. I mean, I'm not even saying don't have debates like this where you give the frame away. I'm saying that it's stupid for society to think about things in this way. This is kind of the post-Rawlsian way where you're not really, you're playing the game of life. And your objective is to make sure that the game of life is as equal as possible from a starting position that's completely artificially constructed in this contrived way that only a philosopher would really appreciate. In Rawls, it was this thing called the veil of ignorance that I might talk about that on some future live stream, but it's a little too in-depth to talk about right now. But that's sort of the perspective that this gay marriage topic is framed within. How do we make things the most fairsy by use of words? The real debate over gay marriage, the real debate that was being debated, was how central is the nuclear family to the management of sexual politics? And this debate didn't begin with gay marriage, but it was more or less the culmination. It began with a sexual revolution. It began with progesterone-based birth control. It began with Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger, and it culminated in gay marriage. And it culminated with the American people saying that marriage really didn't have anything to do with sex. Which means implicitly that the family doesn't have anything to do with sex, and that family structures are about the emotions of adults rather than the proper creation of children and the proper care of children. And we decided all of this with the framing of gay marriage. Now, of course, this is not, you can't say this to someone inside of a debate. If they frame a debate and it's, should gay marriage be illegal? That's a stupid question to ask. The real question, the real political question that Western society was debating implicitly, and that was decided by gay marriage was, do we want matrimony to govern the relationship between men and women? And the answer to that question was no. The other question we wanted to ask was, are our definitions of men and women and their relationship with each other, are those definitions dependent on some kind of biological reality, some kind of real political objective, or simply the feelings of the various communities that are represented in the political discourse? And again, in the case of gay marriage, we decided that the feelings of these political communities were dominant. And of course, this led directly to transgenderism. I mean, the problem with this question is there are so many ways to answer it, right? There's how do we win a debate on gay marriage inside the framing of should gay marriage be illegal, which is a terrible framing. There is why was gay marriage such a blow to the traditional concept of gender relations, which is a little closer. And then the third one, I think, is, what were the eventual consequences and why we know that the stated objectives of the gay marriage movement were bullshit. So here's an example, a King Solomon example. I'll do it in reverse order. Maybe I won't get to all of these possible interpretations of the question. How do we know that gay marriage, the issue, the way it was described from 2002 to 2012, how do I know that this as a civil rights issue, as care for gay families, how do I know that this is bullshit? That's easy. What's the So if gay marriage is good because it makes gay families better. Okay, let's say that that's true. What's the opposite of marriage? Oh, yes, that's easy. It's divorce, right? And anyone who's pro-marriage, who thinks marriage is a really good thing, must believe, conversely, that divorce is a bad thing because it destroys marriage. Worse than destroying marriage, it creates children and then creates children that are inside of what we would definitely call a broken home. Now, many divorced homes can be very, very loving, but it's much worse than it would be otherwise. On average, we can see it in statistics. Okay, so if this is true, and the motivations of the gay marriage movement are honest, in the King Solomon sense, right? King Solomon's the one who had two women arguing over a baby, and then he threatened to cut the baby in two and divide it between the two women. And the real mother said, no, I want the baby to live. And that showed that the real mother cared about the baby and it belonged to her. If the gay marriage movement cared about gay marriage, they would care about gay divorce. Gay divorces are astronomically high. Do you ever hear any of the many, many organizations like GLAAD, or the Gay and Lesbian, the Straight Gay Alliance on campuses? Do you ever see any of them talk about how to reduce gay divorce? Of course not. They moved right on to transgenderism. Because it wasn't about homosexuality. It wasn't about any. It was about essentially, and this sort of answers the second question. Gay marriage was about removing the language that would center in our political discourse matrimony as being the key way to manage how men and women eventually would relate to each other. There needs to be a way to talk about the objectives for both men and women in a sexual marketplace. We need to be able to say, look, it's important that men and women pair off monogamously. Without this pairing off process, our society dies. Our society becomes unstable. We devolve into chaos. We have no more culture that can be sustained. But what gay marriage demonstrated was that priority was less important than making adults feel good about themselves and what they did. And once you say that the overall ecosystem of the collective, the ability to have children, the ability to care for them, and the ability to make sure that men and women mate properly with each other in a way that doesn't screw over either sex, the moment you say that political objective and the language needed to pursue that political objective is secondary to the priorities of community feelings of homosexuals, then that's I think basically the battle's been lost from that point off. I guess I'm going to talk about the future of the USA throughout this live stream, so I might just ask the viewer Red6USA to hang tight for that. But thank you again for your $5 contribution, and I hope I gave you a good response on the gay marriage issue. Again, there's just so many ways to tackle that issue that I'm not going to belabor the point. Die Hard Doogie for $5, a pure contribution. Thank you very much. Mind Diet for $5. I think our first step in creating a counter-cathedral is to find our own John Dewey and William James. We need our own pedagogical epistemology. Yeah, this is a good idea. And the homeschooling movement, this year in particular, the homeschooling movement is good, but we need to take things to the next level, right? We need to take things to the next level. And that is, homeschooling has an obvious disadvantage in that it is manifestly much, much more work for the parents. This is something that I really dread for my own child, is that it's so much work to educate children as their primary educator. And if you need to work to make a living, like I do, and you're not rolling in dough, how is this ever going to be achieved? How are you going to do this? I mean, obviously obviously, there's a lot of sacrifices on the part of parents, and I think that's something that people have to be ready to make. But it's not something for ordinary people, and the homeschool movement needs to be more than a hobby for fanatics. It needs to be something that's more available to people. And to do this, well, I think we need to do what this viewer is saying. We need to create a radical pedagogy. So pedagogy just means a science of teaching things. So we need to create a radical pedagogy that differs from that of the establishment. And given what I have seen from some schools in Common Core, this will not be hard. If we can take the classical educational curriculum and update it in a way that is relevant to modern people, in a way that, because I think a lot of the problem is a lot of the people who do these classical education projects, they do too much copy pasting from previous eras. So for sure, is it called the trivium? I think the classical education framework is called the trivium. So in classical educational frameworks, they have 3 grades. They have grammar school, where you're learning the fundamentals, mainly by rote memorization, spelling, arithmetic, basic math tables. The second one, which is primary, where you're learning things that are like history. You're learning to basically apply your grammar fundamentals to topics involved. And then third, which is vocational, right? You're developing your primary knowledge base in order to pursue some kind of vocation. And I believe those are the 3 stages of classical education. My friend, the Franklin, who's much better versed on this than I am, probably will correct me when I say this. So I'm looking for his comments in the comment section. But that's a general framework of education. But if you go back and you look for the trivium or these classical education pedagogies, they haven't been updated for a really long time. And if this is going to be living, then we have to essentially integrate our understanding of classical educational pedagogy with that which will make people more functional in a digital age. I'm somebody who is a technological skeptic, but I'm not Ted Kaczynski. I think that human beings have to ask very, very hard questions about how technology is enhancing or hurting their lives. But to a certain degree, we have to be able to incorporate necessary technology, and part of that necessary technology is internet technology. Does that mean that everyone needs to be a slave to their iPhone? No. Does that mean we need Twitter? No. I can't imagine a future for humanity where we literally carry around phones like this that have this app called Twitter, which acts as the most egregious platform for arguing with people in social discourse imaginable. And somehow we maintain social cohesion. That's never going to happen. And it's going to be disastrous. So a lot of elements of digital culture are terrible, and we're going to have to do away with them. Or we're going to have to limit them. But at the same time, digital literacy is a thing. At the same time, teaching people how to use card catalog systems isn't a relevant skill. I can imagine a world where we get hit with a neutron bomb everywhere and people have to use card catalogs, but that's a very, very remote possibility. So this needs to be updated, this needs to be adapted, we need to bring this in with new forms of learning. There's a whole world of possibility here. And I think people, this needs to be a big part of the conversation. So thank you for that. I'm hoping that the Franklin in his YouTube channel is going to talk more about this. And also people, I know Steve Turley is also involved in the classical educational system. I really dislike his YouTube channel though, so I'm not going to hold that forward as an example. But again, people who might be more realistic, we need to have a conversation about how we're going to structure homeschooling in a way that's open to people who are not fanatical about it. And this year in particular, when the schools, a large number of schools are closed, and where there is a good excuse to take your child out of schools, this is the moment where we can start building the groundwork for that. This is the right moment to build the groundwork for that. So again, I think that's a very good chat, so thank you for that, and thank you for the contribution. Nerve AMV Maker for $20. The right needs to explicitly state what is theirs and what isn't, and not retroactively change it. If we don't do this, we risk defining territory as not ours because of an unwillingness to defend it, not vice versa. Well, this is a great super chat, and I agree with it in many ways. I kind of feel like giving you a longer answer, but I don't have a really long answer for this particular question, so I apologize, Nerve AMV Maker. I'm going to give it my best shot. The difficulty is that once you don't have the ability to what gives you ownership over something, right? I mean, this is politics. If we're playing politics at the highest level, and this is real politics at the highest level, your ability to defend something and your ability to claim ownership over it are literally the same thing. Now, of course, I believe in a higher power. I believe in God. And so we could talk about abstract rightness or wrongness. We could talk about, divine right of sovereignty and good kings and bad kings and all this sort of stuff. But if this is politics as they are played in a Machiavellian sense, these two concepts are the same thing. And even if we do agree that in the abstract we have a right to own this territory, without an ability to defend it, you will lose that territory even if your claim exists in some abstract or divine sense. And so I think we have to be very, very careful about this. The problem is, and I said this before, the problem is that Red America hasn't come to terms with how much it's lost. Conservative America, liberal America, moderate America hasn't come to terms with what it's lost. The moderate Democratic voter still thinks that they're in charge of the Democratic Party. I'm not so sure that's the case. Perhaps a Joe Biden presidency will disabuse them of this notion. But as far as I can tell, they may go their entire lives, especially if they're older, believing that this is all being done in their name. And I don't know how to say this, but a lot of Red America, a lot of traditional America's reality is they only exert control in a few geographic regions of this country, and the rest of it is firmly within the narrative control of what reactionaries would call the cathedral. And I mean, part of coming to terms with this is realizing that they need to essentially lay down and do nothing and not cooperate with the mainstream and essentially accept their losses in blue areas rather than hold on to a notion of unified America. Eventually, it will become apparent that this country is ungovernable, and somebody who's more reasonable and less ideologically strident is going to make the proper concessions to make this country run in any kind of workable way. So I guess it's my best example. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why homeschooling, this is sort of a frequent reactionary question. Every time that Franklin does a stream, I think he gets this exact question. And the question is this: in Europe, basically in all countries other than Germany at this stage, why is homeschooling still legal? I can guarantee you that anybody who's in the cathedral and considers right-wingers to be their enemies, they all would love to legalize homeschool, and they would if they could, and they know that this is a threat to them. So why haven't they legalized it yet? Well, the reason why they haven't legalized it is because the right wing has made it abundantly clear that they own the right to educate their own children and to determine their future before they come of age. And this has been so explicitly stated that the cathedral, the mainstream, the progressives fear crossing that line. They know that there's a fight there, and then they know that there's no way that they can play with that line at all. And I think in that way, Nerve AMV Maker is absolutely right. That is something that needs to be clear about other things. I'm not so sure exactly what. Perhaps independent media. What comes to mind immediately is maybe firmer lines need to be drawn around free speech issues, around standards for free speech platforms. The issue there, though, is that they already own those platforms. This is something that, who's who's been asserting for 20 years that it owns Facebook? Or Facebook's not 20 years old, but who's been asserting for a decade that it owns all the information on Facebook? Mark Zuckerberg has been making that claim. They have to, otherwise their IP goes out of scope as far as the courts are concerned, and they lose it. If you don't protect it, you lose it. And so when you talk about free speech on social media platforms, you're really dealing with the other end of it. You're dealing with an enemy that's declared their ownership over it, and now you're trying to sneak a word in edgewise. You're obviously the usurper in that case, even though there is the implicit understanding that they wouldn't be evil. And if you ever go back and kind of want to laugh at things in hindsight, the whole "don't be evil" thing is a classic instance of that. Google and a variety of other Silicon Valley companies in the 2000s were saying to themselves, well, our corporate philosophy is don't be evil. Just don't be evil. And it's not cringe that they said that. That of course, what a corporation's going to say, oh, our corporate philosophy is to be evil. It's cringe to think that when they said that, people like myself and a variety of other techie nerds believe them. When I was a computer person in the early 2000s, I was all about open source software. I was all about data ownership. That was 100% mine, and I was always very paranoid that Microsoft would get its hands on it. Then sometime around the social media revolution, I just said F it and handed the keys of my data straight over to Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and the people at Google. And it's because I bought into the stupidest corporate propaganda campaign of all time. And you're still kicking yourself for that, right? We literally witnessed an unlearning of the sensibilities that the entire open source community in the 90s was designed to confront. And we all said, who cares? It's easier if we just hand our information over to corporate America. So again, thanks for that tweet. Thanks for that super chat. Oh yeah, I'm giving my money to Google right now. But again, I'm going to try to change this. I'm reforming myself. We'll see how well entropy works next time. It's not just the ultimate American verbal faux pas to replace well with good. Americans hate the word well. So anyway, redacted for Australian $20. If you only defend, you can only lose. Never gain territory. Praying for the collapse is wishful thinking. I'm not suggesting that we get the Hawaiian shirts out, but we need better ways to disseminate our own narratives. Well, yeah, in the abstract, I absolutely agree with you. But when you attack something, you need legitimacy. You need a claim. You can't just attack out of nowhere. The difficulty right now is that the right is losing ground that it actually controls because it's trying to defend territory it doesn't control. I think that the quest, and I'm a firm pro-lifer, but I think the battle to somehow overturn Roe is just the biggest waste of time. It will never, outside of a cultural revolution among elites, it will never occur. Now, I don't think that a cultural revolution among elites is impossible. In fact, I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary if this country is going to survive. I think it's necessary if we're not going to have a complete breakdown of our society. But to talk about strategy around the Supreme Court, to me, it's just a waste of time. Yeah, I guess I totally agree that we need to capture territory, but I hear that so much ahead of just the next excuse for trying to LARP out. I heard this constantly from the Doolittle crowd that we need to be conquering things. I'm just thinking, man, what are you gonna conquer Seattle? You're gonna conquer the Bay Area? Where is your base? Where is your claim? Right now, Red America can't even drive through a city with flags without getting its people shot. I don't know if you're really going to conquer territory. I think that, Redacted, you do have a really great example. The thing that the right wing needs right now is a way of disseminating its own narrative. And that can't be understated as a political objective. And at this moment, that's going to be a difficult one. We need an area to organize. That's true. I don't think, and this is the thing, I think I was going to talk about this last week, but a few weeks, or was it 2 weeks ago, I think was the last time I had a stream. There was this thing, and I think it's still a thing on Twitter, where BitChute links were blocked. And now I think they got rid of the block and they've replaced them with a content warning. And I mean, I love BitChute and all. I appreciate the service they provide. But people are using BitChute with this idea that it's going to grow into an alternative to YouTube. I think that possibility is dead. Now, if you want to, I host my videos on BitChute. I have a video that's been banned off of YouTube for copyright reasons, not for hate speech reasons. And if you want to go to BitChute and watch that video there, that's why it's there, right? It's a good backup system if you want to back up your videos. However, it's not going to grow into a rival YouTube. I mean, let's just be honest. The nail in that coffin was its banning off of Twitter. The whole point of a video sharing platform is that it accommodates people who aren't your political contemporaries. Right now, the only people who use BitChute are right-wingers, maybe people who are hobbyists, who are gun show hobbyists, or who are marksmen. Maybe they use it too, but even then, that's a right-wing audience, right? And now the main apparatus for discussing politics online, Twitter, is blocking or ghosting or semi-blocking tweets that contain links to BitChute. So the entire purpose, I mean, you might as well host it on your website at that stage. You might as well have an angelfire.com account. The entire utility of social media at that stage has been completely removed. So that's dead. Again, so BitChute, great for backup, great for internally communicating videos inside your own community. It's never going to be social media, and it's not social media. It's not a replacement from YouTube, and no one should be under any illusions about that. And if nothing else, this latest ban should be, and I don't care how much you hope that's going to be the case, it's just not true. And so for the right wing, I think eventually we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that social media, outside of burner accounts, is going to be fundamentally closed to us eventually. And our two alternatives are to implode the social media companies as they exist, but it's also going to be to create alternative healthy communities online that are characterized by quality as opposed to quantity. This is something that I think a lot of people leave out. Since 2006 and the social media revolution, people have been obsessed online with obtaining clout, becoming an influencer, getting a large number of subscribers, and obtaining notoriety that way. This is not something that has classically worked in media, and it's not something that ever worked before 2006. What made good online communities before 2006 was to have a certain quality of users. And I think that we've become bedazzled by this idea that somehow by obtaining clout on social media, we could ride that wave to political power, and it's really impossible. The clout's going to grow faster on the left, so we can't compete with them there. And they will shut down the access to it via explicit platform censorship. So the only alternative, in my opinion, is to try to do what people did in the 90s, is to try to build actual communities of quality online that people make an active effort to get into. How did Mark Zuckerberg make Facebook work? It wasn't the first one. I mean, this is obviously hinted at in the 2011 movie, The Social Network. But how did Mark Zuckerberg make Facebook work better than MySpace or Friendster or all the other ones? Part of it was a more stable platform. It was a newer technology, but again, there were at least three people, who were doing this before Zuckerberg. He did it because he went to Harvard. And he understood that the way you get people into a community is to have high quality young people join. And what are the high quality young people? What are the high quality young people you want to have join your social media platform? The answer, if we're being cynical and we're being realistic, is young women, young hot women, young college co-eds. What do young college co-eds want? Oh, well, they want high status men. So how do you get a successful social media company that attracts high status men? Well, you launch it in a community that's only high status men, and then you initially restrict it so that only high status men join. It's only for Harvard, then it's for Yale and MIT, still high status. And so everyone wanted to join the system because the quality of the people in it was manifest before they actually signed up. And there's going to have to be some similar process on the right. The right is going to have a set of individuals that are compelling in their own right that people want to talk to. And then we're going to have to communicate through platforms that say, okay, I want to talk to so-and-so. I want to get his opinion. He's written a book that I like. He's done art that I like. He has a vision of the world that I think is really, really compelling. He has an interesting agricultural or educational project that I want to be part of. Oh, but I can't find him on Facebook. I've got to go to this more exclusive community. And that's how alternatives actually get started. They don't, you're not going to outclout the left. So again, I apologize, longer answer than I anticipated. Okay, so next question. Government issue for $20. Too many self-identified righties are too eager to go to war. It's the same moral failure the left falls victim to. You have to be prepared not to be important, lest you play into their hand, in the pursuit of being special. Isn't this what Curtis Yarvin talked about when he talked about thymos? This addiction to the feeling of power? I absolutely think that this is the problem with everyone on social media, is that we've become addicted to being an influencer. That we have to think small and with quality first, and then move to independence. And only after quality is achieved, and then independence, do we even think about trying to obtain popularity. Popularity is the last thing we want. Beyond the funding we need to sustain ourselves, we need to think about quality and getting right answers and reflecting value before that. And I think war makes everything easier because as humans, and especially as human men, we have a certain romanticism about winning wars and a certain proclivity that prevents us from thinking about what it would be like to lose one. And because of this, in situations that are chaotic, like our own present year, we constantly imagine wars erupting that we can just win and immediately go on to collecting the spoils. And this sort of overcomes a deficiency in our own imagination. Can you imagine being small and triumphing as a right-winger? Can you imagine being small and triumphing as a Christian? I think the latter is a little bit easier, and we might get on with the second part of the talk I wanted to give, and I might take a little bit of a break here to refill my water before I do that second part. The second part of the break, I'm going to talk about a lot of the issues with the contemporary Christian community that was embodied in one set of tweets. But I think one advantage with the strength of Christians has always been that we have, at least collectively speaking, been somewhat immune to that thymos reaction, to that hubris. I hope I'm using the right Greek word with thymos. I apologize if I'm not. I'm gonna check actually so I can correct myself. Okay. Yeah. It's the feeling of pride in the soul. Okay, yeah, that's a correct use of the word. But I think one of the utilities of Christianity was that A, pride is centered as the greatest sin, and B, in the imitation of Christ, we already, in the early church by extension, we already have a model of how the meek can inherit the earth. and how through quality of a community can triumph over the popularity or the raw power of a community. And I understand that we're also battling against Enlightenment bullshit that right always wins. But we have to be, in some ways, willing to die to obscurity in order to battle past obscurity. It's a paradox in that way, but I don't see any way around this. And so, I think this is something that we definitely need to think about. And this is another reason why I want to re-emphasize art. I just finished recording the first of my next 3-part series, the first part being on Shrek. And it's just refreshing to talk about, to do an autobiographical take on what Shrek was and how it influenced the culture. And it feels like I'm delivering something that's higher quality than talking about, Keith Woods or Vaush or half of this bullshit that it rips on Twitter half the time. But I think conversation is something that needs to go on regardless of whether it's building cloud or you're an influencer or not. People need to obtain wisdom. People need to have a back and forth. And that needs to go on regardless. Even if this channel, were half the size or a fourth of the size or whatever, it would still be important to have these conversations because it's how people make sense of the world. And in this environment where we're all locked in our own houses, waiting for God only knows what to occur so that society can begin again, I think that it's important to have some place where these conversations can occur. I know this was an objective of a lot of people to build a replacement for Discord. That's been, something that I've been trying to get started on, is to build into that plan. But I'm rambling, so I'm going to go on. Government issue for $10. Thank you very much. People think defend now means always defend always. We have to exhaust them before we go on the offensive. Think the USSR in the 20th century. You should only attack where the enemy is weak. The screen is not their weak spot. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think that's a good analogy here, is that the mainstream has this overwhelming attack. I think when you say the screen's not their weak part, you mean that the online world is not where they're weak? I suppose the difficulty is that the distant right doesn't currently exist in any substantial way that's not online. We have an apparatus that is of the more normie conservative, the more Republican establishment variety in real life. But as for any distant right faction, this is a reality that exists first and foremost on the internet. And so what we're trying to do now is either to create an internet community of very, very high quality, or we're trying to find some way of making an internet community become an amphibious community. Start meetups, make friends, forge contacts that are beyond just what you would meet in social media. And again, if you're doing that kind of amphibious project, this COVID thing is one of the worst things that could ever happen. I think it's really important that real life meetings go on, but I don't know. I don't think we can. We have to realize that online is a place where we can grow. And for me, we haven't even scratched the surface of what's possible there. And I think that we've had a real lack of imagination. Things like Urbit and Riot are a huge opportunity for us. A Discord that did not ban right-wingers, that provided the same privileges, that provided the same rights, that provided the same quality control, that could break ground on some really, really interesting communities. And I don't think that we really should pass that by. I think where the mainstream is weak right now is that they're losing their credibility. The media apparatus in this country is losing its credibility, and in terms of print and television media, and I think very quickly the educational establishment is losing its credibility. I mean, right now, the biggest victory, the biggest battles, I think, are going on against the university. it's either in providing an alternative to the university, or it's creating some kind of splinter community inside the university apparatus that already exists, which I think is a lot harder. Now, obviously, the university is the strongest point of the mainstream, but I feel that attacks have to be there in order to be meaningful at all. So at this stage, I think I'm going to take a very, very quick break, and then I'm going to continue with the next part of the talk. So I'm going to mute the microphone and change my water and be right back. All right, so thanks for your patience. Yeah, these long live streams, I have to take partial breaks because otherwise my voice just completely wears out. So before we do the rest of the super chats, I wanted to do the second part of my talk, which I have brought up here. So, I think a lot of people, let me adjust this here. A lot of people are very frustrated with the Christian communities and the Christian leadership. And there was a thread this week on Twitter that I saved for myself, and I'm going to read it here. Perhaps this is only interesting to Christians, but it's pretty short, so I'll read it here. And so this comes from a Twitter user that I'm not exactly familiar with, but I think that he points out a very, very common phenomenon, and certainly this is the phenomenon that you see with a lot of priests in the Catholic Church, especially those who want to follow in the wings of, say, a Pope Francis. Here he's targeting the evangelical elite. So, thread. When the evangelical elite talk about persuasion in the public sphere, they usually assume the following ethos. 1. Punch right, thoughtfully engage to the left. 2. Ascribe good faith to the left, despite many reasons not to, and ascribe bad faith to the right. 3. Attack the right to gain credibility with the left, especially when it's about the right's hypocrisy. 4. Credibility with the left is always the form that shapes the rhetoric. 5. Persuade the left not of ideas, but of your worthiness for toleration, of a willingness to be respectable. 6. Treat every accusation or moral condemnation from the left, no matter how crazy, as an opportunity for public self-criticism. 9. Assess a fantastical moral political theory that would magically appear without the use of civil power. 10. Assert only those narratives of history or events that CNN would air. 11. Never lead or begin an outrage mob. Always join it and Christianize your wing of it. Condemn Christians who do not express outrage. 12. Conceal cowardice and passivity with the words prudence, wisdom, and Christian witness. 13. Question the motives, hypocrisy, principles, and winsomeness of every Christian who might act or speak politically for some other end that bothers the left. 14. Act in confidence with the resolve only when criticizing the right or when advocating for something the left agrees with. 15. Whenever you attack the left, always morally equate them with the right, which effectively redirects your criticism from the left to the right or your fellow Christians. 16. Every condemnation of the left must include a condemnation of the right, and if you can't do the latter, then you stay silent about the former. So, I don't know how many people watching the stream are evangelicals, but I don't think that this is only an evangelical phenomenon. This is a common phenomenon you see a lot in Christian circles, but I think in particular in Christian circles that have two things. They have a historical Republican identity. They're pro-life. I'm thinking here of people like Russell Moore. But also they have elites. They have people who have PhDs, that have degrees from Yale and mainstream universities, and they need to keep contact in the favor of a broader academic or political community. And so I think what this phenomenon embodies is a really irritating facet of Christian and conservative leadership. If a person were to do all 16 of these things, does it really matter on paper what his opinions are? Whether they like or dislike abortion? Whether they have the right opinions as to women being priests? I guess in the theological sense, as pastors, as priests, those questions of theological import are the most important. And that's certainly how you should conceptualize them as spiritual leaders. But as political leaders, this is useless. It doesn't matter that if you support the right on paper, that you vote for the right candidates, that you support the right policies in the abstract. If you take this perspective, where every interaction with the left, you grant the moral framework of the left, and then essentially punch to the right in terms of disapprobation, you're essentially operating as a functionary of the left. I think because of this, a lot of people who see people do this, they're like, oh, well, they'll say like, this is optics cucking. So because people are cucking to optics, and they explain themselves as being prudential or having wisdom, that means ultimately they're a facet of the enemy, and we have to attack them, and we have to not care about optics. I think this essentially is just learning the wrong lesson. There's a way to react to this in a poor way. The issue with all of this is that I think we have an improper understanding of how spaces and dialogues work. Again, this is something that didn't translate well from Linux to Windows, but we have an incorrect view of political discourse. That text should not be highlighted black. You can thank LibreOffice for that formatting transition mistake. Usually you like to think about it as, I'm on the left of this issue, I'm on the right. You've got a one-dimensional political spectrum. I guess it doesn't really matter how many dimensions you add to this political spectrum, but your position on the issues determines exactly where you fall. But we know that this isn't actually how discourse works. We know that discourse works with certain narrative assumptions, and these narrative assumptions put you in certain boxes. The pastor who does what this previous Twitter user was complaining about, they probably have all of the right opinions on abortion, homosexuality, but they're operating out of the narrative box of the left. And every time they do that, it doesn't matter how theologically correct they are essentially strengthening the left's hand, and they're weakening the right's. They're weakening any opposition that could occur to the cathedral, because they're saying, hey, this Overton window you have, this Overton window is a good thing. We all need to get into this community. But guess what? The left controls the doors, the left controls the direction, the left controls the framing and the center. So this isn't really a very useful way of looking at how political discourse goes on. Instead, what I would like, I think what people need to look at, and I mentioned this a little bit in the last live stream, is people need to be able to see things in terms of developing communities. So instead of talking about left versus right, you could talk about the mainstream versus the distant right Overton community, or Overton window. But here we're talking about a group of people. Overton windows they're located with their center somewhere on some objective left-right scale. Certainly that's true. But in addition to that, they also have their own internal left-right dialogues. And people move internally inside of these communities. The issue, though, is that they share a moral framework. They share an understanding of what's right, of who you can criticize and for what reasons. For instance, you'll notice that if it comes to radical right-wingers, the Overton window of the mainstream goes something like, they're horrible piece of shit people who have no redeeming qualities and who just want to hurt people. Whereas radical left-wingers, even if they're convicted pedophiles, like I guess one of the people that was attacking this Kyle character just the other day, they'll get the treatment of, well, communism has had a very, very hard history, and there have been many unethical people who've tried communism, and it's just not practical, but isn't it a very, very nice moral idea? There's no moral judgment there. The moral judgment is reserved for the right-winger. And of course, it's not hard to see that in an immoral environment where all radical right-wingers are sociopaths and all radical left-wingers are idealists with misplaced ideals, the left is obviously going to win every single time. It's a predetermined conclusion. So because of this, it doesn't matter if you have. It doesn't matter if you're David Brooks and you have Republican point of view. If you grant that moral framework, you're just part of an apparatus that's moving to the left. You're just progressives driving the speed limit. However, I think you can see when people break with the narrative, the moral narrative, and this is really what the distant right is about. The distant right isn't just about people who are radically to the right. In many ways, our opinions are less radically right-wing than a lot of people you might find in the Republican Party. What defines us as a group is that we've broken with the narrative community of the left. We are no longer in their Overton community. We have disagreements. I have disagreements with people on the right and me, but I do not use that as a way to countersignal them. I do not treat them as hostile aliens. And because of that, we have a conversation, but we do not have some kind of vicious moral attack. The vicious moral attack occurs between Overton communities, not within them. Because when we're inside the same community, when we're inside the same learning place, we have to have a certain amount of cordiality. This is what a lot of people don't understand about academic communities. And I did a video on this and I never released it. Maybe I'll release it later this year if I have more time to edit it. But academic communities are always polite to each other. You could have very, very very, very vociferous political disagreements inside an academic community. And they'll use polite language because they're aware that if people call each other frauds casually, if they attack each other's moral character, if they start knife fights over every single academic disagreement, the academic community will end. A lot of right-wingers don't understand it, and it's one of the reasons why blood sports would never work for the right. The right wing has to essentially adopt the same policy. Inside our community, we have to disagree with each other, but always disagree cordially and minimally countersignal each other. While at the same time, we have to push back against the cathedral, against the mainstream, as something that is fundamentally illegitimate and has lost the faith, rightfully lost the faith, of everyone who was ordinarily considering it to be a truth-telling entity. That's the meaningful battle. The battle inside the boxes is not as meaningful. And notice here in the illustration I have, I kind of cooked this up before the live stream started, there's overlap, right? So you could have people, I think this is genuinely true for people like, say, an Andy No, or an Ian Miles Chung, or a Sargon of Akkad. They might be people who are, in the abstract, on the left when it came to an actual measurement of opinions. But they do not grant legitimacy to the community that currently controls the mainstream progressive opinion throughout institutions like the New York Times. And because of that, they contribute to the community of the distance, of the right-wingers. Because every time they speak up, they make our community seem more legitimate, and they make the community of the mainstream seem less legitimate. And this really is the war as we are fighting it. Whereas there can be many opinions inside these communities, there really only can be one moral framework. And I think this is what we have to return to if we're going to figure out how to handle Christianity. I think a Christianity that endorses the moral framework of the mainstream is a Christianity that's going to die. I understand that there are many good faith people like Russell Moore who have conceded to this, but I think they're just being unwise. They're not being prudent, and they're being drawn into something that they don't really understand. They have to either endorse an opposition to the mainstream narrative that puts things like equality and sensitivity and diversity as central moral precepts, or they have to declare war against that mainstream and recenter more classical values that have been more classically embraced by the Christian tradition, or ones that are completely revolutionary. And in that decision, I think is going to determine whether these people are meaningfully contributing to what we are building now online and perhaps eventually, hopefully, in real life. So that's the other thing I really wanted to talk about, a little picture there. So with that, I think I probably have an hour more to answer Super Chats and expand on these ideas. I know today has been a little bit more rambly than usual for these Distant streams. I'm trying to do them more frequently, and today has been kind of a really wacky day for a variety of reasons, so a little more tired than I used to be. Oh, I guess I also wanted to talk about Moby Dick. That's a fun conversation, I think. So Moby Dick, I finished it, I think, a week ago, and it really wasn't what I was expecting in a variety of ways. I think, as someone who knew basically what happened in the story, and I think everyone knows what's happened in the story, Moby Dick, there've been so many Wishbone specials, there've been so many Reading Rainbow summaries when you're a kid. You kind of get the gist of what happens in any classic story of literature, because you've seen it reenacted by cartoon characters for the umpteenth time. But what I was expecting narratively from Moby Dick was something that was more along the lines of Charles Dickens or Dostoevsky. Sort of a plot-driven narrative that largely focuses on the psychological state of a set of very, very realistic characters. And I think that that's how I was picking up the book to begin with, and that's where I really went wrong with reading it. Moby Dick is, in my opinion, in hindsight, it's less a book about a realistic whaling voyage, even though it was based on a real whaling voyage where the whale sunk the ship. And it's based more on allegory, and it's almost based more like a poem. It reminds me the most of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and for this some reason I think people misread it. For instance, I'm not ruining anything here. The actual confrontation with Moby Dick, which if you read it in the abstract, just the last 4 chapters of the book, it's actually a riveting action. It's really engrossing, but it's only like 4 chapters in like a huge book. It has over 100 chapters, so it's actually a very, very small amount of the book. And moreover, the development of the characters like Ahab. I was expecting reading Moby Dick that Ahab would first come off as someone who is psychologically stable, and then gradually we learn about his obsession with this white whale. That's not really the case. You learn that Ahab is obsessed with at an insane level with Moby Dick right from the start, right from your introduction to the character. And he's only really humanized towards the end of the book, in the last few chapters. It's only then when you get a glimpse into the inside of what he must be like as a human. Other than that, he exists archetypically as this insane creature who's just constantly going after this whale. And moreover, Ishmael, too. What is Ishmael? Ishmael is... I described him initially when I read the book as an autist, right? He's this person who has this meticulous detail orientation for whales. And people who don't like Moby Dick complain constantly about how probably a good 30% of the book is not actually dedicated to the plot of the book. It's dedicated to talking in the abstract about whales and the art of whaling. And a lot of people just skip over those chapters, and that's an enormous amount of the book when they skip over them. And I think all of this is just a misreading of what Moby Dick is. Moby Dick is an elegy to whaling, told with archetypically poetic characters that are unrealistic. They become human in moments, but those moments of humanity are more like soliloquies. They're more like vignettes dedicated to illustrating a kind of person, a kind of Nantucketer who dedicated himself to whaling or to killing these creatures, and now is confronted with a dilemma. I don't think they really exist like in a Russian novel to string a larger psychological profile across multiple pages. In that event, the only way to read Ishmael is either a madman or an autist. He's the kind of person that goes to a foreign country, sees a whale skeleton, and because he doesn't have a piece of paper, he literally tattoos the measurements of the whale skeleton onto his arm. But if you read it instead as Ishmael being less of a sailor and more of either a poet or prophet, then immediately everything falls into this really great relief. And for this reason, you shouldn't read this as a plot about a whaling expedition that happens to have these useless chapters about whaling. You should read it as a meditation, in my opinion. And the chapters about whaling are told in a sort of poetry. There's this great example, this extended meditation on Jonah, that's given in a discussion about how whale anatomy works. There's an extended description of a whale temple that exists in North Africa. That's one of the most beautiful parts of the book. And these all exist inside the useless whaling chapters that a lot of people skip over. It's not about that. It's an extended meditation, and part of that is reading in detail the language with which he describes the whale, with which he describes the circumstances of the confrontation. And really, in that light, I think the characters are really more archetypes. I don't know. I haven't really come to definitive views on the book itself, but that's sort of where I'm starting in reading. And I think it's really much more like poetry than it is like a modern realist novel. But okay, I'll get back to reading Super Chats now. Maybe I can hide the window. It's kind of a distraction here. Yeah, and by the way, the art is Bruegel's Fall of the Rebel Angels. Another one of my favorite artwork. I thought it was kind of interesting backdrop for a discussion on the rules of engagement this week. Okay. Okay, let's see. So I got Government Issue. Oh, another one from Government Issue. Government Issue for $5. I wanted to wait for Entropy so you get more money, but I think it's important to calm the Kylodizers down. Don't give the media free ammunition, guys. Kylodizers. Oh, those are the people who are idolizing Kyle. I mean, it looks like he was in the right, but man, if anything had gone differently, if he had aimed incorrectly, if he had been a little bit too hot under the collar, if the right people with the cell phone equipment hadn't been there to record him, someone drawing a gun on him, he could have shot a bunch of people, and if they hadn't had pictures of the guy with the gun, the media just would have lied about it and said he shot unarmed people. If anything had gone wrong, the guy would have been under a life sentence. He might still be under a life sentence. And any attempt to push back on these insane riots would be destroyed. And Joe Biden would have just the kind of villain that he's been looking for to make it so that the civil unrest isn't actually going to hurt him. So I mean, we need prudence. And I know every time I say we need prudence, I sound like one of the other categories of people that I was talking about. The Christian pastors who constantly counter-signal against the right and play into the left's narrative in the name of prudence. But that is a warning against the misuse of prudence. It isn't saying, oh, well, I guess that means we don't need wisdom anymore. We don't need optics. That's just insane. So thanks again. Frederick Zachariason for SEK $50. Thank you very much. I think we right-wingers want to feel... Oh, SEK $50, pardon me. Thanks for the morning entertainment. Well, you're welcome. You know, people complain about these things going on too late. I have no idea when to do them. The only time I can manage live streams that are long enough for me to answer all the super chats are ones that are done very, very late at night. The only other way to do them is to do much, much shorter ones, and it would only be even a little bit earlier. It's just not worth it. My schedule is such that I'm really working either on my day job or helping out with the family, and this is the only time I have to really do it. So I appreciate people I understand this is a very inconvenient time period for people who are in Europe or for people who are in the on the west coast or in the east coast of the United States, but again, it's the time you have. Will H for $5. I think we right-wingers want to feel like everything isn't going to ruin. It's very easy to slip into the old, comfortable mindsets of the 1900s. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing is that, I hate to say this, right-wingers aren't going to get the old back again. We're not going to conserve anything. We say rip conservatism, it never conserved anything. But it's not like the dissident right's going to conserve something. The dissident right's going to build something new that's real and that carries on the spirit of the old. But it's going to be a new thing. It's not going to be the old thing in any way, shape, or form. And the new thing that's going to be built is going to be adapted to the world we live in within constraints of reason and with an understanding that many of the directions we've taken and that have been presented as unchangeable need to be actively fought against because they're destructive to the human form and to the human person. But at all moments, I think we need to remind ourselves as right-wingers, we're not going to save things. We're just going to build something new that carries them forward. I hate to use a biblical example, but you're like Lot. You're not going to save Sodom and Gomorrah. You're just going to build something new. And maybe you're carrying the things out of Sodom and Gomorrah that really counted. But you're not going to save this society. You're not going to save what was the United States. I think that there still might be a political apparatus of order that we need to preserve. And that order will be essential to making sure that we can build. You can't build without order. But it will not be the West we knew as children. It will not be the West we read about in books, that we see in historical documentaries. That's gone. And the thing that needs to come is something new. And this is something that I wish, if right-wingers could write science fiction, that would be amazing. I think it's something that we really should think about in the future, is to think. And so much science fiction is right-wing, which is the real irony of the whole matter. It's not like it's a genre that's untouched by people on the right. So anyway, thanks for the super chat, Will H. Nicholas Dolinger for $5. Thank you very much. What are your thoughts about the Jansenist controversy? Give me a second and let me Google that. The Jansenist. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, this is like the total... Okay, so, good Lord, you've caught me off guard. Okay, so, yes, now that my memory's refreshed, the Jansenists were a sect of Catholics that I believe wanted to incorporate elements of Protestantism, such as total depravity, and I think they were post-Trent. And I know that Pascal was an adherent to this movement. I'm not so sure about Arnauld. I don't know of that thinker, so I apologize. To be quite frank, I don't have a huge opinion on the Jansenists. I can ask Helen. Do you have a huge opinion on the Jansenists?
Who?
They're a heretical sect of Catholics, like from 400 years ago or something. Aren't they in your closet, in our bedroom closet? The headphones you wanted? Yeah, I think so. Just check on the ground. Sorry, guys. Sometimes burning questions come up, like where did I leave my headphones? It's just a slice of life you get in these live streams. It's the kind of small touch that makes you certain you're not watching Nick Fuentes. But otherwise, I'd have a backdrop of like skyscrapers in Washington D.C. or something like that. I look like the Jay Leno show, and I'd be wearing a tie right now. Instead I'm wearing a T-shirt. It's a more low scale operation, to be sure. I really wish I could say more about the Jansenists. As far as I know, they're completely historical. I haven't studied up on every Christian sect. I wish I could answer that better. I really apologize. Maybe you could teach me something about them. Apollo Too Good for $7. What are your thoughts on how the RNC went? Personally, the finale pretty much made me forget all of the pandering. Well, I don't really participate in politics explicitly, so there's that. I think it looked better than the DNC. I'll say that. Trump's speech was incredibly uninspiring from what I saw of it, and I just saw clips, but it felt really rambly and it seemed very long. I think the highlight of it, the thing that worked for him, was the fact that he pointed out that the Democrats are responsible for the chaos that we're seeing in our streets. But I just don't really feel super invested in Trump. I get it that it buys us time. But again, eventually the forces behind Joe Biden are going to win. And Trump's not doing anything to hold back their forces indefinitely. So there's that. I don't know. Ultimately, I mean, ultimately, law and order is going to have to be a major part of any reclamation of power by the right wing. And that's something that, we're going to have to incorporate. I don't think Trump is actually spearheading any kind of long-term or large-scale pushback against the left, and because of that, I can't get enthusiastic. But anyway, Nerve AMV Maker for $10. Why do modern progressives have none of the positive quantities or qualities of their Puritan ancestors? Puritans forced themselves to live up to the standards they pushed on others. This isn't true of progressives. Well, I don't know. If you talk to progressives, there is one virtue that they will ordinarily brag about, and that is working really hard. This is a psychological problem you'll see with many progressive content creators, is that progressive content creators like Thought Slime, they'll feel guilty about not working hard enough, even though they produce a lot of content. And you just know that this is an element of their Protestant heritage coming back to bite them. I don't know. I think virtues and morals are things that if you don't actively try to facilitate in themselves, you lapse from them. You have to constantly be reinforcing them. And so once these explicit virtues are no longer explicit but implicit, they naturally atrophy away. I mean, I guess the quintessential example of progressive hypocrisy is the fact that they constantly talk about diversity but live in non-diverse areas. To me, this is almost always the consequence of progressives being delusional rather than them being absolute hypocrites. I'll take some later, thank you. The reality is that they've convinced themselves that their circumstances are unique, that they don't live in these areas because they just happened to not get in on all of the good areas that are highly diverse, which do exist and are totally a model that works. And after all, they don't want to gentrify these people, right? They don't want to disrupt these ethnic communities, with their gentrification. So there's always ready-made excuses, and there's no one really holding their feet to the fire. If there were reactionaries that they respected, that they had to answer to as authorities and the media that they consumed, then they'd be in hot water. Their hypocrisy would be immediately apparent for everyone to consume. But this is something I did this debate or discussion with this guy called Kevin Bird. I think it was about a year or two. It was 2 years ago. Man, it feels like a lot sooner than that. But he is this progressive who's all about diversity, and he's part of a PhD program. And I hit him with the normie conservative point about how, okay, well, you're all for diversity, but you're not giving your own seat up. And he's oh no, it wouldn't make a difference. It's all systematic. What difference is it going to make if I give my seat up? This is just a Republican talking point. And then when we talked about the issue of housing, he goes on about how boomer progressives are hypocrites, about how they don't put their money where their mouth is, where they don't actually send their kids to African-American schools because they're afraid of poor performance, and yada, yada, yada. And this is the biggest hypocrisy, and how when he's a parent, he's going to totally just live in the worst areas, and he's just going to bite the bullet and do it. And I told him, and I don't believe this. I don't believe that when it comes to your education, you're all about how individual sacrifice is meaningless in the light of a collective problem. But now here you are guaranteeing that when it comes to your child's education, and perhaps even your child's safety, you're all going to be gung-ho and be altruistic and sacrifice your child. I mean, first of all, I don't think that it's even moral to sacrifice your child. I think it's horrifically immoral to sacrifice it for your own virtue. It's the reason why you can't sell It's the reason why in Christianity you can't sell your child into slavery and then use the money to give to the poor. It doesn't work like that, right? I think it's horribly immoral to sacrifice your children for your principles. But even then, I mean, just realistically speaking, why if you don't sacrifice your own education for your cause, I don't believe that you're sacrifice your child's well-being for a cause. I just don't believe it. But of course, this is the thing. People don't have to answer to hypocrisy unless there's a person that they respect that holds their feet to the fire. They never have to answer to their hypocrisy. And the problem is that if it's someone on Fox News calling out their hypocrisy, they don't watch Fox News, and the Fox News has no moral standing to question them. So it would be like a Muslim imam talking about the hypocrisy. I mean, you've seen this before too, right? Like in the 1950s, there was a Muslim imam talking about the hypocrisy of conservative Christians because, what was it? Sayed Qutb, I think. I'm mispronouncing his name. But you know the guy. He came to America in the 1950s. He was one of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood. And when he came to America, he went to a bunch of conservative Christian congregations, and they had dances where the men and women were in each other's arms, right? And there were no firm guidelines for dating. I mean, implicitly, there was the suggestion that there was no sex before marriage, and that was certainly one of their morals, but they went all on board this dating thing. And the imam said, this is complete hypocrisy. This is complete. They've already conceded to modernity and to decadence. No, I don't believe that. My wife and I dated, and we remained chaste, and people do it, and we've hosted dances at parishes, and that certainly would have offended the sensibilities of this gentleman. But I think we should have taken that hypocrisy more seriously. He was making a good point, and he was cutting to the core of a core moral hypocrisy. Oh, but do you think anyone in America felt called out by this hypocrisy? Of course not. They're like, oh, he's Egyptian. Who cares what he thinks? The same thing is true for Ted Kaczynski. He calls out, again, American conservatives for not understanding technology's role in the degeneracy process. You think Rush Limbaugh or Newt Gingrich took Uncle Ted seriously? Of course not. He had no moral standing to hold their feet to the fire. Now, again, Sayed Qutb and Ted Kaczynski I disagree with, and I think that they took it way too far, but there was a kernel of truth, and there was a kernel of truth in their accusations of hypocrisy that conservatives needed to take more seriously, and they didn't. And that's because nobody takes moral accusations of hypocrisy seriously unless they come from a source that has moral authority. And currently, Red America and conservative America has no ability to do that, so progressives can get off scot-free. Zachary Bolduc for $20 Canadian. You've often mentioned thinkers without mentioning names, other than ones from the Dark Enlightenment. I'd like to get another modern thinker. For reference, you said Mollbug was your favorite secular thinker. Well, I mean, okay, but so you want contemporary thinkers that are right-wing, that aren't like Nick Land and Mollbug or Spandrel. I mean, I guess I'm kind of struggling with that. I mean, I'm not. I frequently talk about people from the early 20th century, like Mosca and Pareto and Burnham, and even earlier like Carlyle or de Maistre from the 19th century. I guess I'm sort of struggling with it. I guess there's no like PhD professor that is talking about reactionary ideas in the way that I would want him or her to. There are a lot of people from the conservative tradition that are catching wind of the reactionary critique and incorporating it. I think Patrick Deneen did excellent work in Why Liberalism Fails. Obviously, the late Roger Scruton, he's very much in that tradition. I'd say other people... I'd say an earlier generation would be Bloom or Alistair McIntyre, who I think also caught wind of reactionary ideas and incorporated them into sort of a paleo-conservative critique of the system. Again, that was more of the 80s and 90s than it was the contemporary world. I think that you're just going to find the harsh reality that most reactionary thinkers, most people who are trying to develop ideas, we can't function in the academy because we get witch hunted. And so I don't think you're going to get a Roger Scruton would never get tenure. And certainly someone like Nick Land or Menges Molbug or Curtis Yarvin would never. I mean, imagine writing what he did and then expecting to pass a tenure, to get accepted for tenure. I mean, you'd have people demanding he resign. I mean, you'd have people, he couldn't even enter campus as he is right now. So I don't know. I think we have to realize that we're kind of confined to the internet. And if that's not, I'm afraid to say, I think we have to develop people who write under their real names. But that's going to be something that, I don't know. I mean, maybe I will at some point do something like that. But for now, it's going to be pseudonyms, bloggers, and people who are not definitively not in the academy. I don't know. Maybe Zachary, if you want to chat me or something, I can check. The @ replies. Maybe you can clarify what exactly you meant. But thank you for the super chat. I really appreciate it. Colin for $5. Yes, we should focus on areas the left hasn't fortified. School choice vouchers, homeschooling. Okay, teachers unions, decentralized education. Okay, sorry, I kind of trailed off there. School choice vouchers, homeschooling, teachers unions, decentralizing education. Okay, so I'm sorry, but school vouchers and charter schools, that is not going to work how it operates in the 90s. One, the teachers unions control the institutions that accredit. There is that. Anyone who goes for vouchers or for charters, they essentially have to get money from the most progressive areas imaginable. So let's say that you have a charter school company. If your charter school isn't something that the city of Chicago or the city of Seattle wants to write a big check to, or isn't going to have activists burning down City Hall if they do write a big check to them, then your competitive advantage for getting a charter in the biggest school districts in this country has been curtailed at a very, very low level. So I'm not saying that private schools couldn't work, but this whole 1990s idea that you're going to get municipalities and highly progressive state governments to hand over checks to radical reactionary schooling institutions, man, they have so many ways to BTFO that approach that it's just, I think we need to be thinking radically different than that. Vouchers, if it was in a more general sense, such that it was a reimbursement for school for parent. I mean, the way I would phrase it as a tax credit given to parents who want to school their children through non-traditional means. Don't make it so that the state is writing any check. It goes out of the hands. It's just like, if you don't use the public school system for your children, we give you this tax credit for not impacting the school system. Now, you still have to get around the teachers' unions, which is not an easy thing to do. But I think phrasing it that way means that you don't have to do this incredibly, ridiculously horrible, weird long shot where you have to come up with some way of passing off your Christian school as something that the district of Washington, D.C. or New York is going to feel comfortable handing over a big hunk of cash to. So I'll say that. Decentralizing education is an objective, but in order for this to work, this is the critical part we need to leave out. We need to make it cheap and we need to make it easy. Does it have to be like idiot proof? Does it have to be lowest common denominator? No. But it has to be enough so that a person with 115 IQ who works 10 hours a day, a really to support his family, and who has a mother who's very, very busy. It has to be something that they can do. So maybe co-ops are a solution for this. Maybe, co-ops would be a solution for this. And developing these things inside areas that we absolutely control, pioneering their methodology, and then showing results is a way that we could enter into this new sphere and make really, really significant strides without having to essentially become constrained by the regulatory apparatus that's necessarily imposed by cities. Another thing that would be really, really useful, online adult education. If, for instance, we develop a curriculum for children that's focused on non-enlightenment or reactionary authors, this could be redeveloped for adults, for college students. It can all be digitized. It can all be shared online. The university model that's currently putting the middle class in an insane amount of debt is incredibly inefficient. It's Victorian in origin. There's no reason for that to be there. There's no reason for 40% of the population to go into massive debt for what? So they can get a degree that they don't use. And the whole point of a college education was that it identified you as being part of the elite. But once half of the population went to college, then it no longer was something that identified you as part of the elite. And therefore the competitive advantage was effectively nil. And that's how you have college graduates being coffee baristas for years and years and years. JT for 10 yen, 1,000 yen. What is your cut and run point vis-a-vis America's trajectory? Where will you possibly go, and what factors into your choosing a backup? If I recall, you have routes in Eastern Europe, the Volga Germans. Well, I mean, I would have. I guess I do have some distant relatives that live in Central Europe, but most of the community that my father came from was ethnically cleansed out of there in 1946. So, they all fled to either Canada or Brazil or the United States, or some of them got shipped to Siberia. I guess maybe I think we have contact with some people that got re-released and are living in Germany now, but that's not, and I think I speak like a few words of German that I learned from my grandmother, and I spoke a little bit of it when I took it in high school and college, but it's not there. Well, I mean, the cut and run point from America is when it does not feel safe to be here. And that's a very, very subjective choice. And it's not something that, obviously the state's burning down right now. It doesn't feel particularly safe to be here to begin with, but we own property here. We have a family here. We have connections here. Taking that financial hit before its time is a huge blow. It's a huge blow, and it just sets your entire family back years. And so I guess I want to be really, really careful. I have a hard time answering this question without being very, very personal. So I really thank you for your contribution, but I don't know. All I can say is that when my family no longer feels safe, I guess politically speaking, the point is where it's obvious that the Democratic Party does not want to protect white middle-class families that live in the hinterlands or that live in the suburbs. Once it becomes apparent, as it is in some cities, that there is an open season on neighborhoods and then they're not willing to protect our property, and that their political priorities come before our safety, then I'm out of here. I have to be. But before that, I think prudence is needed. JT for 500 yen, an addendum. Also, please stream with Renegade of Funk. Yeah, I'd love to stream with Renegade of Funk. I'm just behind on my conversations. I think that the last person that I really wanted to stream with was Colin from Faraday Speaks. I think that we were going to have a discussion about right-wing versus left-wing dialogue. I think it would be interesting. But yeah, I guess I do fewer conversations because my availability for live streams is just so late. I mean, who can make this time slot? Like almost nobody. I have free time now, but it's just, what do you mean? I mean, it's not. I mean, no one who has a reasonable schedule is going to be able to, in a different time zone, is going to be able to meet at this stage. So, government issue for $5. By screen, I meant big screen. The irreducibly complex institutions. The internet is nearly the only place the right can win non-pyrrhic victories. I totally agree. Here's a good question. Who watches movies anymore? I mean, I don't watch movies at all. I mean, I'm trying to get rid of Netflix, to be quite honest. Again, I'm not airing family disagreements here, but we have a disagreement over Netflix. And I'm trying to get rid of it by all means. But just in terms of movies, both me and my wife I love the experience. Oh, don't you just love it? I'm getting excited just talking about it. Man, I'm getting excited just thinking about it. Walking into a movie theater and smelling popcorn. I hate eating popcorn, but I love smelling it. And the really unhealthy popcorn that has like the incredibly starchy and buttery smell to it. I mean, that's just great. And you walk in and you're like, oh man, I'm going to see a show. This is amazing. The problem is that for 2 years of seeing movies, I have seen none of them that have been not complete insults to my intelligence. What was the last one I saw that was at all good? I thought The Mule was okay, but that was like, what, a year and a half ago? It's been an unmitigated disaster since I didn't even like The Joker. And that was supposed to be the one that was supposed to be We Live in a Society, the movie. So I completely feel you with the whole movie thing. But just that experience, I don't know. Wouldn't it be fun to rent movie theaters out and show reactionary movies? Like you could show that great movie about Yukio Mishima. Just the thought of that is interesting. I like it. A government issue for $5. You really are doing God's work, Dave. You're too kind spending the time you did on my super chats. Godspeed. Well, thank you very much, government issue. I actually really appreciate the super chats because it gives me something to talk about. Sometimes I feel like I have a really, really good prepared talk. Other times I feel like I have what could have been a tweet, like a tweet storm, and I'm just repeating it live. Maybe I should experiment with just going to speaking from a cuff and just going off on tangents for the first part and not have the slides. I think the slides might hurt things more than they help. But, we'll have to see how it goes. I'm trying to perfect the art of doing the live stream podcast because I think this is going to be more regular. Like I said, I've got a 3-parter. I've just recorded one 45-minute section of it. But 3-parters take a long time to make. So it is what it is. And this one's a long one. There's something that I call, YouTubers talk about this a lot. When you have an idea and you don't do it immediately, your idea grows and grows and grows and grows and grows until it's almost impossible to get the idea from your brain into some kind of coherent narrative that works well as a video. I call this content constipation. And the Shrek video has been in my mind for like 4 months. So it's bloated out to an incredible size. It's not even really about Shrek anymore. It's about the 2000s and a variety of other media that weren't even made in the 2000s. But this is, I know a lot of people like Millennial Woes complain about this. If you wait a long time to work on a video, it gets harder and harder and harder. And this is something that, I knew this after my first year of doing YouTube. The thing is, initially, before I had the baby, I have an idea, and I had, a night or two. I just would, put the blinders on and do it all at once. But these days, your time works differently. Like you get an hour here, and you get like an hour there, and sometimes you get half an hour, and you don't have your notes together and all this stuff, and every time you have to take down and start up again, you get less and less recorded. So at the end of the time, you have all these little snippets of the thing. You have to put them all together, which of course takes longer. So I don't know, everything is just going slower. It has to. Mind's Eye for $2. Have you read An Anxious Age? Let me look that up. Who wrote it? Okay, here it goes. No, I haven't. It's by Joseph Bottom. An Anxious Age, The Post-Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of America. Wow, does this ever sound Moldbugian? Well, I mean, I'm fascinated by it. I'll certainly give it a look. But this seems to be hitting on the same things that I think a lot of people have been talking about in the new reactosphere. So, thanks for that. Okay, going back to the super chats. But thank you for the suggestion, Mind's Eye. I'll have to read it before I can comment on it. Redacted for $2 Australian. We rented at a community center and watched Zulu. Zulu. Oh, Zulu. God, I have complex feelings. I'm going to totally alienate my audience. Oh, Zulu is simultaneously a reactionary film, but it's also kind of not. I mean, because the depiction in Zulu is just, I mean, like, it is a heroic battle of the British against basically a huge black army. And in that sense, it's not very politically correct. But at least in the first half, the depiction of the British soldier, the depiction of the British leadership and the British soldiers are terrible. They look like immoral, lazy people who are prideful and don't really believe in their own cause. Moreover, the depiction of Christianity is a religion for weak people. It has a lot of... You could tell that the creators had a lot of progressive sensibilities going into this production. They wanted to tell the story, but they wanted to make it nuanced. And by nuanced, they had to portray the soldiers as kind of being very unadmirable. I think that was the least admirable, that was the least accurate thing about it, because whereas I think this certainly might have been true in the 1920s, that the British soldiery was totally demoralized and disillusioned after World War I. But this is before 1914, right? This is the height of British self-confidence. I would imagine the British officer corps would be incredibly gung-ho and brave, and so I didn't really like the depiction. I guess the idea, and maybe this is what makes it reactionary, is in the process of fighting the battle against the Zulus, the British soldiers go from being the unmotivated wastrels, the people who were disillusioned, into the very fighting force they were trained to be. That the battle forges them and makes them more men. And I think in that's a very, very nice story. Obviously, the reason the cathedral hates it is just simply the color coding of the people involved. Otherwise, I think the sentiment would be more or less very, very similar to that you'd find in a Vietnam War movie. No comment for $5. I love your streams and videos. You really helped me grow as a reactionary dissident and introduced me to so many different perspectives. Well, thanks. Hopefully, that's what I want this stream to be. Is I want to introduce people to as many new ideas as possible. The new video about Shrek, I keep on calling it a video about Shrek. It's not just about Shrek. It's about Shrek and Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods, and the book Steppenwolf, and Eugene Ionesco's The Rhinoceros. It's kind of a narrative that includes all of them. And all of these, this is the thing, I think we'll discover this as the dissident movement grows and as the cathedral weakens. Every piece of art that has truth, goodness, or beauty in it is naturally ours, and we can naturally say we like it. It's only the people who are lying that have to fear. It's only the people who are containing within themselves or within their political narrative some core dishonesty who have to fear the political agenda of the art they consume, at least if they're highly intelligent. Now, that's not to say that you just throw the doors open to children, right? To people who are vulnerable, or you encourage movies that are pornographic and totally immoral and things like this. I think of a movie like Antichrist, and I can't think of a good reason not to ban it. It's terrible, and I like Lars von Trier's style a lot. But I think that the goal of an education, a traditionalist or reactionary or right-wing education, whatever we call the replacement for the cathedral's education. After you get out of college, you should be able to walk into a movie that has a communist agenda and appreciate it for what it is. For instance, the next movie I'm going to watch, I can guarantee you it's going to be the movie Reds with Warren Beatty, which at the time of its release in the 1980s was considered to be a communist sympathetic movie. It tells the story of John Reed. I think it's John Reed, he was one of the instrumental people in transferring the culture of the elites away from its secularized Protestantism to out and out, fully secular, only pseudo-Christian socialism. He was an out-and-out communist, and he went and fought for Lenin's army and died and is buried inside the Kremlin walls. And Warren Beatty, who I think produced the movie, was very, very sympathetic to these. I mean, they really were almost traitors who went and fought for Lenin. But someone who's intelligent, who comes out of a system of higher education, they need to be able to see these things and grapple with them and deal with them, even though they are, and find the true, the good, and the beautiful in them without necessarily being shaken or morally hurt by their exposure to them. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind always. I think a lot of times the problem we have on the right wing is lack of an imagination. I just want to tell people who watch here, throw the streams out, try everything, just create, write science fiction, write. Look at crazy stuff like Voyage to Arcturus, which is a great book. Something that inspired C.S. Lewis. Kind of Gnostic in its perspective, to be sure, but a brilliant book and one of great imagination. And I think that if we regain our imagination, we really don't have anything to fear in the long term. I think what we have to fear is that we are going to fight an endless losing battle to preserve a social order that is obviously dead. We are never bringing the 50s back. We are never bringing the 1890s back. We are never bringing the 1770s back. Those periods are dead. Okay, here's a good question. Here's a good thing. I spitball with this idea for a science fiction novel. Someone from the chat's asking me, what ideas should a right-winger writing science fiction explore? So I think a right-winger exploring science fiction should challenge the core assumptions. This is not a new idea, but it's something that I think would be incorporated in any right-wing vision of the future. Technology is not a destiny, it's a choice. And at some point, there will be a technology to destroy ourselves. And if technology is a destiny, then the destiny of the human race will be self-destruction. So any society that exists past a certain technological level will have to say, we're not doing that. The second thing that I kind of wanted to explore, and I spitballed this idea, is everyone who looks at a humanity that is in the future, it always imagines humanity homogenized, genetically homogenized. The future of humanity is going to be that disgusting Anthony Bourdain had this clip where he's like, all I want is humanity to be all the same kind of coffee color, right? Like, they all should just be the same coffee color. They should speak the same language. They should have kind of the same religion. And that would just be the ideal. I mean, first of all, I in some sense, I want humanity to have the same religion because I believe there are right answers in religion. But not on all the other fronts, on culture, on color, on appearance, on way of life. Why would you want a future that's so boring? If anything, if humanity were to spread out to the stars, wouldn't we want to see more diversity? Wouldn't we, more real diversity? Wouldn't we want to see not a homogenization, but a heterogeneous humanity? And what kind of systems would we have in place to make sure that different people could live together in peace or could not kill themselves? You know, I see someone talking about Canticle for Leibowitz in the chat. That's another great example, right? Well, someone's asking, would reactionary literature be more psychological or symbolic? Psychological or symbolic is a stylistic choice. If your artistic movement cannot master both the symbolic and the psychological, I mean, I'm not saying individual authors have to master both. As a matter of fact, I can't think of any authors that have ever mastered both. But a movement, any kind of community, has to have both. I tend to believe that right-wing art is always realist. And that is because it is humanity's inclination to always go towards fantasy. Now, fantasy is good, but you know, Game of Thrones had such an opportunity to be a right-wing creation, and if George R. R. Martin was right-wing and was willing to make the lesson of Game of Thrones be a right-wing lesson, I think he'd have a much easier time writing Winds of Winter. The problem is that everyone knows that Daenerys Targaryen can't be the goodie at the end of this whole thing, and everyone knows that the lesson of Game of Thrones has to be either some form of Christianity in a cathartic form or some form of Machiavellian revelation in a realistic form. And anything else than that is insulting the audience's intelligence. So I do have a personal inclination for realism. That's my favorite genre in the 19th century, and you know, I would pursue that. But realism can be combined with fantastical elements. You know, you can. I think, for instance, you know, Romanticism and Surrealism are two forms that, in their pure essence, I hate. I don't never go pure Romanticism is the same. That's the equivalent advice I'd give to never go full retard from Tropic Thunder. You never go full romantic. You always have to combine Romanticism with something. Jane Austen combines Romanticism with realist social interaction. That's what makes Jane Austen good and not just literary detritus of the early 19th century, and even more so with George Eliot. And I think, you know, if you want to do surrealism, you have to answer questions about what it tells us about the realistic human form, and in that, you know, use whatever psychology or symbolics you'd like to use. This is an amazing question. Brian N. for $5. Any advice for first-time soon-to-be fathers? I just say, I mean, because the problem with this is a great question. I don't feel like I've mastered this. I feel like I really have a lot of learning to do as a father. Like, I constantly am learning new things. I think it's sort of the biggest hurdle for me is figuring out when to stand back and when to come forward. I think when you first have the baby, it's like, oh, I need to be there at all times. I need to be constantly attending to this child. But that's not realistic. I think we took the baby to the emergency room like 4 times in the first month. It was something ridiculous like that. You know, I remember looking at the bills and just going like, what is going on? So I don't know. There's nothing I can say here that experience isn't going to teach you. I have to say, just, I mean, I don't know. I'm torn between philosophical advice and practical advice. The practical advice is just kind of to learn learn how your baby is trying to communicate with you. And I say that as a hypocrite because I still haven't mastered it. You can tell when he's crying because he wants comfort, and when he wants a change, and when he wants food, and when he's actually in distress. And the same thing is always to get into patterns. That's something that I have learned, is to always have patterns where you can be fully focused on the baby, and when you have a little bit of time to yourself at the end of the day, which is what I'm using right now. I think that helps keep you sane. I think my life's become much more orderly since I've had a kid. And the third thing, and this is the more philosophical thing, is just to kind of embrace it. I think that, you have a new identity as a father, and you're going to kind of change your identity. And I think that it's kind of good to welcome that. I think the beard here is kind of a symbol of that for me. This is my patriarchy merit badge, so to speak. But thanks for the super chat. That's the best I can give right now. Help your wife out. She'll need it. Listen to other parents too. Just ask a lot of questions about parents. And this is the difference between me and, obviously I want to listen to my in-laws and my wife wants to listen to hers. And sometimes they disagree. And then just be forgiving to your spouse, right? You're both really tired all the time. And you got to be forgiving. Okay, I guess I still have, it's 12 o'clock, so I should, someone's saying Rhodesia forever again and again in chat, and, I don't know, man, it's a dead country, right? I appreciate that it was great while it existed, but, now is the time to build something new, right? Now is the time to, I'm not even so sure that America isn't a dead country. So certainly that's, I should say for the super chat, I need to say to Brian here, congratulations. It really is a good milestone. I don't know. People are asking about neo-reactionary genres. My favorite genre is pulp. I've always thought, and I've toyed with writing a pulp novel that contained deep implications in it. And that, I don't know if I have the time for that in this stage of my life, but it's always been an ambition. Just when you're doing something, don't ask what's the right genre for reaction. Just look at your society and look what is honestly going on in the society. The society is tearing itself apart. Just what honest things can I observe about the society I live in? And then try to tell that truth in a genre that really inspires you. If that genre is space opera, do it. If the genre is high fantasy, and I really hate high fantasy, do it. But the genre and the mode you speak in is part of your individuality. That's up to you. In some sense, this is sort of a quote from Mulholland Drive. Whenever a writer writes something, there are certain things that are up to them, and there are certain things that aren't up to them. And you have to relish the things that are up to you. So much of the form of writing, how it has to be paced, the truth that you're trying to express itself, that's not up to you. But what you talk about, the nature of the story, the genre you write in, all of that is the expression of what ignites you. As a passionate creator. So I would just say embrace the liberation where it is. And people talk about reactionaries not being obsessed with liberty, and oftentimes the idea is that we just don't appreciate freedom enough. But when you realize that freedom has to have necessary limitations, it makes you appreciate those instances where you get to embrace it all the more thoroughly. Well, as the super chats have kind of calmed down, I think that I'm going to end this live stream. I see people talking about potential projects that I'm working on and whether they want this or that. I'm just going to I've got a list of things in the priority I'm working on. I've just got to go right down the line and do them. again, I have got a day job, so I appreciate it. So I know this was a kind of more confused Distance live stream. I think probably the next one will be the one I do on Devil's Dictionary. Again, expect these more regularly since the 3-part series I'm working on is really large and it's going to take a little bit longer than usual to produce. And I've ditched the rule where I don't do back-to-back distances or back-to-back live streams. So there's that. I think it takes the pressure off. So with that, I have to say that I'll wish everyone good night and have a wonderful rest of the week. Everyone stay safe, do what's best for your family and your community. Stay thriving, always be building, and may God's blessings always be on you in the coming times. Have a good night.